So yeah, I've been with Element almost 2 years, but I've been in this industry for maybe 33, 34 years. I was doing my first EMC testing around 1989. I used to work for a big manufacturer. We had our own EMC test facilities. And then I worked for commercial EMC labs for a while, and then I've been a certification body for a while, living in the UK and America. And now at Element, I look after a lot of our different labs. So like here at Hull, you might go, wow, we've got like 4 or 5 radio engineers and 2 or 3 certification bodies. But on my laptop, my spreadsheet of our radio team has like over 200 people on it. So I'm looking at all of our labs around the world. So why are we here today? What's this all about? Very few of you probably woke up this morning and thought, do you know what, I want to buy an EMC test. I just think it'd be a really interesting thing to watch. I'd like to sit next to a chamber and see the spectrum analyzer whiz across. In reality, what you really want to do is just get your product to market as quickly as possible, and somebody has told you that part of that stepping stone to get there is doing an EMC test. And similarly, you know, you've put a radio product, you put Bluetooth or whatever into your product. You probably think, I've got to do these Bluetooth tests, like how long does the hopping channel last on each frequency? You probably don't actually care how long that is. You just want to get your product to market as quickly as possible. So that's the point of this, really, is not to kind of label exactly which tests you're doing and why you're doing them, because I know that why you're doing it is to get your product on the market, and that's the whole concept. Alex, can you see the screen okay? Yeah. All right, okay, cool. So, one thing that, so I've got 45 minutes for this presentation, and this topic usually takes me about 2 days. So I've really condensed it into most frequently observed mistakes, I would say. The real basics, but the stuff that I think people get a lot wrong. And so my first top tip is to learn to separate testing from approvals, as they're 2 very different topics. People seem to think, all right, I'll take my product along to the lab, I'll get it tested, and then when the testing is done, I can sell it. Well, the testing is a bunch of measurements that is on the journey towards getting your product ready to sell it. If you pass those tests, then that's a good sign that you're on the right journey to being able to sell your product. But it's not just about passing or failing the tests. Similarly, if you buy in a product and you think, well, it's approved, it's got the right approvals markings on it, if you're not using it in the way it's approved for, then you might need to retest it. So for example, if you buy in a certified radio module or a module with a CE mark on it, it's an approved product, so it could be placed on the market. But if you put it in your product, you're going to have to test again. You know, so just because something's approved doesn't mean it's going to pass all the tests. Just because you've passed all the tests doesn't mean it's approved. So you've got to learn to sort of separate them into similar topics, but not the same thing. So let's start with the European Union. So that's an area that we obviously used to be a part of. Now we're not. But we're going to talk about the Radio Equipment Directive, which is known as the RED. And it applies, so it was written in 2014 and it came into force in 2016. And it applies to anything with radio in it. So radio equipment used for radio communication or radio determination, so any sort of radio functionality. So let's take, for example, this laptop here. In the past, let's say that laptop didn't have any radio in it whatsoever. You would have applied the EMC directive and the low voltage directive to that laptop. Now it's probably got Wi-Fi or Bluetooth in it, so you would apply the radio equipment directive to that laptop, and you would not apply the EMC directive, nor would you apply the low voltage directive, because it's got some radio function in it. My watch here has GPS in it, has Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, so this is a radio equipment product. And that little pendant that Alex said about using as a case study, the radio equipment directive would apply to that because it had Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. So the EMC directive and the low voltage directive wouldn't apply. But I'll come to an interesting point about that in a moment. So any type of transmitter, receiver, sometimes people call me up and they say, got my product, radio equipment directive doesn't apply because it hasn't got a radio in it. And then I'll look and I'll say, no, it's got GPS. And they go, yeah, it's got a GPS chip, but it doesn't transmit anything. You go, no, yeah, but that's still a radio, actually. So the Radio Equipment Directive applies to any radio of any frequency up to 3,000 gigahertz. The old RTT directive used to start at 9 kilohertz, but that low frequency sort of level was removed. So if you make a product and you put radio into your product, you design it in, you're in scope of the RED. Or if you buy in some radio module and you put that into your product, then your end product is in scope of the RED. And it's not RED directive, because the D of RED is directive. Okay, so the RED is a trade document. It's a trade document for being able to sell a product all around the EU. If you open up the RED, you won't find terms like megahertz or watts or dBMs. You won't find spurious emissions limits. You won't find anything that says you have to do a spurious emissions test. It's a trade document to allow you to sell a product all around the European Union. One of the articles within it, Article 3, says you'll have to do a technical assessment if you want to meet the RED. And that's just one of the many responsibilities for a manufacturer. There's only one authorization route, which is declaration of conformity. So if you make radio equipment or you've radio enabled your product and you're applying the RED, it's all declaration of conformity. There's no certification. Just this morning, I had an email from a really big company saying, is there a way to find the list of CE marked radio equipment based on their certifications? Like a copy of their DOC. And I just looked at it and thought, how can such a big company not understand there's no registration, there's no certification, there can't be a list of CE marked products because there's no requirement for a manufacturer to tell anybody else. So, this Article 3, the technical assessment, what does it cover? Product safety. So within the RED, it says you must assess the thing, your radio for product safety. It even mentions the low voltage directive. So it will say, assess it for safety to a similar level or similar sort of consequences, if you like, similar sort of process as if you would have done under the low voltage directive, but you're not legally applying the low voltage directive, but you're doing a safety assessment just as if the low voltage directive had applied. Now, interestingly, that little pendant that Alex mentioned, let's say it was powered by a volt, 1.5 volt or 3 volt battery, that wouldn't have been in scope of the low voltage directive because it's below the 50 or 75 volt cutoff. However, the RED specifically says, no, that low voltage thing doesn't apply. So a little pendant like that, that's battery powered, would have been outside the scope of the low voltage directive. But as soon as you put Bluetooth in it, and it's in scope of the RED, a full safety assessment is necessary to the sort of testing equivalent, so EN 62368, for example, product safety. And within product safety is every form of safety. So it's got a transmitter that sits next to the body. So RF exposure is a very important part of it. So all aspects of safety. Even things like, if it was one of those alarm things, so if you faint and or you're feeling bad and you press the alarm, then does it work properly? That's a real consequence then. EMC performance. EMC emissions and immunity are in the text of the Radio Equipment Directive, and that's why the EMC directive doesn't apply. The RED says do your EMC assessment to the same sort of levels as the EMC directive would have done, but without actually applying the EMC directive. Radio performance, this is transmitter performance and receiver performance, and some other categories. In previous years, I would never have mentioned these other categories again, but you need to be aware of them now that from the 1st of August 2024, one of these other categories, or actually 3 of these other categories, will suddenly become enabled, and they're all to do with cyber security, fraud, whether your product can be hacked, things like that. Okay, so the Radio Equipment Directive, declaration of conformity. Only the manufacturer can write and sign the declaration of conformity. The assumption is that it's manufacturer as in the person who's designed and made the product. But really, legally, what it means is whoever's name is on the product, they are the manufacturer. So if you take somebody else's product, rebrand it with your own name, you legally become the manufacturer and you sign the DOC. Or if you design and think of some product and you send it off to China to get it soldered together in a factory, it's your name on the product, so you're the manufacturer. So it's usually the actual company doing the manufacturer, but really it's whoever's name is on the product. But also, we're not in the EU. So legally, we're no different to China or India or America or any other country outside the EU. So if you're shipping a product into the EU, then the importer, who's based in the EU, takes responsibility for the fact that they've taken your non-EU product and helped it onto the market in the EU, and that's why the EU-based importer needs to have their details on the product. Some directives mandate that there's a responsible party in the EU. The RED isn't one of those directives, so there isn't that requirement. But if you, as a manufacturer outside the EU, and if you've somehow found a loophole, and I can tell you how the loopholes are in the Q&A bit, but if you've somehow avoided the importer and distributor steps, then you need an EU representative to sort of close up that loophole. But in general, if you're sending a product to the EU and your importer receives it and places it on the market, you don't need an authorised representative in the EU for the RED. Okay, so let's say you're assessing a product for the RED. Hopefully you can kind of see this, but I think you're going to get copies of the slides. So you're going to do a safety assessment. Mustn't press the button that Alex said don't press. So safety assessment covering product safety, acoustic safety, RF exposure safety, light safety, everything gets assessed on the whole product. The radio performance, the electronics, the fact it connects to the mains, whatever. EMC, emissions and immunity, is assessed on everything of the product. So if you put Bluetooth into a washing machine, you're assessing it as a Bluetooth transmitter, but you're also assessing it as a washing machine, because that would be in scope of the RED. Transmitter and receiver performance, and those other things. They all get assessed as part of your demonstration of compliance to the RED. If there are any other directives, like it's also a machine, or it's also medical equipment, or maybe the ROS, they get assessed to their other directives, and then finally, you have one declaration of conformity signed by one person in your company, which states that you meet all of the applicable directives. So one DOC listing all of the directives that apply. Now here's an important point that a lot of people kind of get wrong. Placing on the market. Okay, you're placing a product on the market. And when I say placing a product, I don't mean model 123. I mean model 123, serial number A. Like a individual product is placed on the market. You CE mark the individual product and the DOC goes with that product. And if the next day you make another one, if the rules have changed, you have to reassess for that next one. There's no grandfathering. So let's say, for example, your marketing team says to you, we expect to sell 3,000 units over the next few years. So plan to make 3,000. So you make one, you test it, you get your assessment done, you think, right, we've done everything we need to do, I'm going to CE mark my product, I'm expecting to sell 3,000 of them. Your factory leaps into action. Then they go to a shop in the EU, let's say, I don't know, Tesco's or an Amazon warehouse or whatever, and then finally they end up in the hands of the user. So let's say you've made 1,000 of them, and the 1,000 of them went to the shops and then they went to the user. So 1,000 of them are in people's homes being used. And then you make another 1,000 of them and you ship them to the EU, and they're in the EU on the shelves of shops, ready that anyone could buy them at any moment. But your final 1,000 of them are still in the factory. They haven't rolled out the factory yet. You've done all your testing, you've CE marked, you've written your DOCs. Suddenly, the test standard changes, or the requirement changes, or the European Commission says cybersecurity now applies. The 1,000 that are in people's homes, you don't need to physically recall them. They were on the market, so they're fine. The 1,000 that are in the shops in the EU are physically on the market in the EU, they're fine. But the 1,000 that haven't left your factory yet, They are not on the market, so they would need to be reassessed, maybe even redesigned, maybe even retested, because they haven't been placed on the market in the EU yet, even if they've got the exact same model number as the other 2,000. Your risk assessment, I'll talk about a bit this afternoon. A lot of people think this is some crazy add-on document, but really it's the first document you open when you're planning a product and the last document you close when you're going to place it on the market. All the sorts of things are to do with compliance planning. Can I even sell my product in the EU? A lot of people come to me and they say, I've got this great idea for a product, I've designed it, I've made it, it does all these cool stuffs, everybody's going to love it. And you look at it and go, that's fine, but it's not allowed in the EU. It transmits on frequency bands that are not permitted for this in the EU, or it operates in a way that's just not allowed. Also, the EU is still 27 member states. They don't all have the exact same frequency allocation tables, and they don't all have the exact same rules. So there are a lot of products that you could sell in some member states, but not all of them. And can I sell it the way I want to? Well, people want to be able to make a global solution. They say, well, I'll sell it, and then the customer, the user, can select European mode so it only operates on European frequencies, or we'll let them update the software, but that might not be okay because you're leaving your company's compliance in the hands of somebody else, and that is not okay. Do I need to test for the Radio Equipment Directive? There's nothing in the RED that says you have to test. Nothing at all. It says you have to assess it for radio performance, EMC and safety. Well, why do so many test labs exist then? Well, because testing is the easiest and most risk-free way of demonstrating compliance. You don't have to test, but everybody does because it's the most sensible solution and it's the best way of going, look what I did, look at all the evidence I've got. I signed my DOC, that's my legal requirement, but my test reports are the best evidence that I can think of. You need to assess for safety, EMC, and these other things. And these types of standards called harmonized standards. If you test to a harmonized standard, it gives you a thing called presumption of conformity. If the standard isn't harmonized, that's okay. You can use a non-harmonized standard, but it doesn't give you presumption of conformity. What does presumption of conformity mean? Expression I'd never heard until it existed through directives, and so it's a bit of a bizarre statement. Well, if you've tested to a harmonized standard and you have presumption of conformity, then you can stand there and go, I've done my bit, and it's somebody else's responsibility to prove to you that your product is not okay. You can just go, prove to me that my product's a problem. I've tested to a harmonized standard. Whereas the standard isn't harmonized, it's the other way around. You're going, I've done a load of testing, and here is why I think that was okay. And then the other people, market surveillance, whoever, can go, come on, prove to us why you think that non-harmonized standard was a good thing to do. The DOC, though, is to the directive, not to standards. Your DOC is always saying, I meet the requirements, I've assessed everything, and these standards are just a tool, or the testing I've done was just a tool to get there. So I've mentioned that it's all DOC, there's no certification, and now suddenly I've mentioned a notified body certificate. So you go, well, Michael, you're kind of contradicting yourself here. It's all DOC, no certification, so what is a notified body certificate? Well, a notified body certificate exists. It's somebody who would be able to look at what you've done, look at your test results, look at your product, how your product works, and decide if they think your product would meet the Radio Equipment Directive. Quite conveniently, under the old R&TT directive, it was known as a notified body's opinion. And that was really quite a useful term because it really gave you a real sense of what that document was worth. But it was the only directive that used that term. All the other ones used the term type examination certificate. So they changed the name when they went to the RED. A type approval certificate means I'm certifying it. A type examination certificate, which is what this is, basically means I've examined it, and here's my certificate to you, to the manufacturer, to say I think your product does meet the RED. And you take it and you keep it, and that allows you to sign your DOC. It's not mandatory in all cases, and I'll come on to that in a moment. You label your product, you have to put the CE mark on your product, and you have to have contact information, company's name, company's address, things like that. If If your product is too small for your information, then you can put it in the user manual, and it's your decision on whether you think your product is too small or not. And it specifically says in the RED that as you're selling your products, you are expected to do sample testing to make sure that the products you're placing on the market remain compliant. Because, of course, you could probably just test one day and sell it, and if you never changed your design and the standards never change, you might sell thousands of them. The RED doesn't tell you how much sample testing to do, and it doesn't tell you how often to do it. It's up to you based on the number you make, the number you sell, and how good you think your manufacturing quality control is. If you think your manufacturing quality control is good and your pass margins are really good, maybe you'll do less sample testing. If you only just passed, or you think maybe you've changed factory or changed some other thing, probably you do more sample testing. So if anything changes then, if the standards change, the way you notice people using your product changes, your design changes, then you would need to reassess your product to make sure you're always up with the latest requirements, because remember, you're not certifying to a standard, you're using standards as a tool to sign your DOC on each new day that each new product goes out. So if the standards have changed, of course, you'll be reassessing. Doesn't mean a complete retest, it might just mean checking the standard and thinking, has anything changed? So there's the technical documentation that you end up keeping for your product. You've fully assessed your product, and if market surveillance or somebody comes to you and says, let me see the technical documentation, they're asking for the evidence of why you signed the DOC. So it's going to describe your compliance route. You've got to keep it for 10 years after you've placed the product on the market. And if you wanted to ask, do you mean the first one or the last one that I sell? Is it 10 years from the first one that left my factory or the last one? Then you didn't understand that slide, because you have effectively a technical documentation for each unit. So therefore, of course, it must be the last one you sold. So it's the manufacturer's records, also market surveillance authorities, although really they're the least of your worries, I would say. But also if you go to a notified body for a certificate, they'll ask to see the type examination certificate. Now, one thing, there's nothing in the radio equipment directive that talks about radio modules, but I'm going to mention them because everybody is interested in radio modules and it's kind of my pet topic. There's no such thing in the radio equipment directive as modules. There's no modular approval because there's no certification. So you can't have a certification transfer from one thing to another thing. The manufacturer places a final radio product on the market and they're responsible for it. So if a company who makes radio modules wants to sell their module in the EU, they've got to CE mark it. And they CE mark their module just as if it's any other radio equipment. They'll test it as radio and they'll CE mark it as radio so that they can sell it. And if you make a product, then you will CE mark and sell it. Maybe it's already a radio, your product, or maybe it's an electronic device. And if you put a CE marked radio module into your product, you've created a whole new final product, and effectively the CE mark of the module is gone or lost or void or whatever term you want to use, and you've got a whole new product. So if I've got a Bluetooth module and it's CE marked, that's great for selling that module. And if I've made this projector to the EMC directive and low voltage directive, that's great for selling that. Now, if as the projector manufacturer, I permanently install a module into that and then place that on the market, I've got a whole new product and I'm responsible for the radio, EMC, safety, and every aspect of compliance of that. So I mentioned notified bodies, right. So a notified body's type examination certificate for the manufacturer. I mentioned Articles 3.1a and 3.1b, which are safety and EMC, and Article 3.2, which is radio performance. Article 3.3, which is these other parts. If you are able to use harmonized standards for the radio performance part, then you do not need a notified body. In the future, August 2024, when the Article 3.3, like cybersecurity parts, come along, they will be similar to 3.2 in that, again, if you can use harmonized standards, you don't need a notified body. But for radio performance, and in the future, the other bits, if you do not fully apply harmonized standards for all of it, then you must have a notified body certificate. For the other parts, safety and EMC, there's no mandatory requirement to have a notified body certificate. You can get one if you want, and we do a lot of those, but even if you use non-harmonized standards, you don't have to have a notified body certificate. When you're selling your product then, as I said, you've got to be tracking changes to your product. Keep an eye on any changes you make. Keep an eye on the standards that you're applying. Keep an eye on any of the regulations. Like if cybersecurity comes in and you're already selling some product, then the products that you haven't placed on the market yet of that product range will need to meet it. And if you see how your product is being used changes. You know, a great example there is mobile phones. So mobile phones, they used to be held to the head for a phone call, and then they were clipped onto the belt for a phone call with your earphones. Nowadays, most of the time, we hold them in our hands. So from an RF exposure or safety point of view, we got pretty much the same product, but the assessment requirement has changed dramatically over the years because of how people are using that product. Okay, so the basic process then is that you assess it or test it, you label it with your CE mark, maybe you get your notified body certificate if you want to, and you create your DOC. So then that's your kind of testing route and your approvals route. And then you maintain your technical documentation, and then you keep selling it, making profit, eating ice cream, watching for any changes. If any changes occur, go back to the top of the thing, maybe for a bit of a reassessment. Okay, sorry I'm whizzing through this quite quickly. I'm going to make a few comments about the UK. So in the UK, we obviously left the EU. We've got the UK's radio regulations and the UKCA mark. The UKCA mark applies from the 1st of January 2021, although the UK has made the decision to continue allowing CE marked radio equipment into Great Britain until the end of this year, if the technical assessment requirements are the same for that product in the UK as they are in the EU. Be aware, obviously, the scope of the radio equipment regulation is, they basically copy and pasted the radio equipment directive into the radio equipment regulations, but don't assume that it's all the same, because the UK has different spectrum frequency bands than the EU for a lot of products. Can I sell it in the UK? Well, the UK is only one country, but just because a product is CE marked doesn't guarantee you can sell it in Britain, because there might be different frequency bands, different frequency allocations. What standards should I use? It's the same approach like testing standards, but the UK has their own list of UK designated standards, and it's a different list to the EU's harmonised standards. Back in January 2021, when the UK did a copy and paste of the European standards lists, they were briefly identical lists, but since then, the EU has updated their list a few times, and the UK hasn't always kept up with it, so they are different lists now. And there is a UK approved body, which is the UK's equivalent of an EU notified body. So if you haven't used a designated standard for UK, you'd need a UK approved body for the UK, and then maybe an EU notified body for your CE marking. Okay. And again, that's important when you're tracking changes to standards. You've now got two lists of standards to track. So, you know, kind of increased your workload, if you like. And of course, you'll need a UK DOC with your product, as well as your EU DOC. Okay, so now let's fly across the Atlantic very quickly to the USA and the FCC. Should have opened this beforehand. The FCC recently updated that logo, so it looks all high-tech with satellites. Up until very recently, it looked like an electricity pylon with lightning coming out of it. Okay, so you've got the FCC rules and regulations. FCC covers just one country, the USA. And it has this big, or literally, when I first started in this in the late 80s, it was literally a book, a big, heavy book. Now, of course, it's all online. If you want to know if the FCC rules apply to your product, then it really is for any electronic or electrical device or radio equipment. So it's a bit like a mashup of the EMC directive and the radio equipment directive. Obviously, today's focus is radio. It does not apply to military equipment. So the FCC covers commercial, industrial, domestic user sort of thing. Police and ambulance and everything is covered, but not military. Okay, so there's two authorization routes for the USA. There's Supplier's Declaration of sDoC, or Declaration of Conformity, which is for electronics and a lot of radio receivers. And there's certification, which typically is for transmitters. So you might say, and I'll explain this in the other slides, you might say, well, what about my laptop here? It's an electronic device, but it's got Wi-Fi in it. So which is that? Is that DOC or is it certification? And the answer is, well, it's both. You do a DOC for the electronics, and you do a certification for the Wi-Fi. And in fact, some products are exempt from authorization. So they would be in scope of the FCC rules, but they don't need any authorization. And there's a little list. And one of the examples is radio receivers that are below 30 megahertz or above 960 megahertz receivers. So for example, you go, oh, okay, so GPS receivers don't need any authorization. That's correct, because they're 1.6 gigahertz. Electronics for use in a vehicle are exempt from authorization, but transmitters used in a vehicle are not. So if you had the infotainment system of a car, for example, the electronics part don't need authorization, but the radio part does. So, covered in scope of FCC assessment, RF exposure safety, so like the effect on the human body because of the transmitter, but not product safety. You will struggle to sell your product in the USA if you haven't done a safety assessment, but the safety assessment in the USA is all about suing people if you get hurt, which is really why one of the earlier safety labs was an insurance company, right? Underwriters Laboratory. So the safety assessment is something you do through an NRTL, but it's not a regulatory requirement by the FCC. EMC emissions is covered by the FCC, but they don't care about EMC immunity yet. And radio transmitter performance is part of the FCC rules, but radio receiver testing is not yet, but it will be soon. So let's look at the DOC. So for your DOC, let's say you've got an electronic device like this projector or the electronics of this laptop. You must perform the tests. So straight away, very different to Europe. You must perform the tests. You must perform them to the exact standard that the FCC says and the exact way they do it. If you deviate from the test standard because you think you found a quicker way, your product is not authorized because you didn't follow the right process. You compile and keep your data. You label your product to say it meets the FCC Part 15 rules, and you sell it. There isn't a DOC document. So with Europe, DOC is a document that you supply with your product. With the USA, the DOC is a procedure that you follow. You don't give the customer a DOC. You don't create a document. It's a procedure or a process that you follow. You would put some statements in the user manual which proves that you followed the DOC procedure, and you have to have the name and address of a USA company in your user manual that the FCC could contact to ask them about your DOC procedure. And you have this optional logo that you can put on your product. For years, people think this logo means I did some FCC stuff, but it doesn't. It specifically means the DOC procedure applies to my product, and I followed the DOC procedure, and you can come and see me if you want to see evidence of it. Certification then, very similar. You must test it. You must test it in the exact, precise way as defined precisely in the standard, and if you don't, your authorization is void. Again, you keep your documents ready. The only difference, though, for certification is that you must submit all your documents to a certification body, like me. And then the certification body, like me, would review all the documentation and certify your product. So all FCC certifications are performed by a TCB, a telecommunications certification body. So we're an industry group. Basically, the FCC used to do the certifications themselves, but they decided to privatize it and farm it out to industry. The TCB is allowed to do some things that the FCC can do, but we're not allowed to do all the things. So we can certify products. We can do, well, we must do market surveillance testing, but we cannot interpret the rules. So if the FCC rules are very clear and you follow the FCC rules, then the TCB can do the certification. If there's anything unclear about the rules, no matter how clever the TCB is, we're not allowed to interpret it. We have to go back and ask the FCC. There is a crazy situation where the FCC have lost some technical staff recently, and so a lot of the FCC engineers are quite new, and sometimes they'll come and ask people like me who've been doing this for years for our opinion, but we still have to ask them to make the final okay because of their rules, and they're the legal owners of it. So the TCB can only do the certification. We can't make judgments. We can't say, okay, you deviated from this test, but I'm okay with that deviation. We're not allowed to do that. So you can have multiple authorizations applying to a product. So for example, I said this laptop here, it could have a DOC for the electronics and it could have a certification. The little pendant that Alex talked about, it would probably have a DOC for the electronics and a certificate for the Wi-Fi and a certificate for the Bluetooth. My mobile phone will have a certificate for the LTE or cellular part, a certificate for the Wi-Fi, a certificate for the Bluetooth, certificate for the RFID, and a DOC for the electronics, and a DOC for the receivers that are between 30 megs and 960, like some of the LTE bands. So, similar to my slide for Europe then, you've got your EMC assessment of the electronics, your EMC assessment of the transmitter, your radio transmitter, and your safety of the RF exposure. Instead of assessing one whole product, it's like you're assessing them individually for each of the different modes, like the cellular mode, the Wi-Fi mode, the Bluetooth mode, and you're assessing them very, very separately. And they might have a sDoC or a certificate for each individual mode, and then that will all lead down to your FCC authorization of that end product. And if it happens to be something like a medical device where you've got the FDA, then that's a completely separate federal agency. You would need them both, but they're not linked. The FCC's longevity then, you know, like with Europe, I gave my example of you've sold 1,000 units, you've got 1,000 units in the shop, then the test standard changes, what do you do? That's not the case with the USA. The USA, you have a product certification, and it's a one-time thing. So if you make your product, the FCC rules do not change very often. It's very, very difficult for the FCC to change their own rules, and they do all they can to avoid changing their own rules. The certification is to the rules, and the standard is a tool for getting there. That's similar to Europe. But if you test to the standard, and then you get a certification, and you start selling your product, and then the test standard changes, doesn't matter. Certification is done, and you can keep changing it. So it's harder to get the certification, because you're not allowed any flexibility. But once you've got it, you're off and running. So grandfathering is the term. So, you know, I've seen products that are certified for 20 years. The standards have changed so much, it's unrecognizable. But those products are still certified, and they can keep selling them. There are some rare occasions where the FCC do change their rules, and in which case they would tell the industry, okay, you are actually going to have to make a change to your product now. So, planning for the FCC. Do I need to test it? Yes, you absolutely do. It's not a choice. You have to test it, and you have to test it exactly the way the standard says, to exactly the standard you're told. Otherwise, no matter what, even if a test lab says, here's your report, or the TCB incorrectly says, here's your certificate, none of that matters. If you didn't test it correctly, your authorization would be void. You need to test for the EMC emissions. transmitter performance, RF exposure, and only using the authorized standards. If there isn't a standard, you can't go to the TCB and say, what do you think? You have to go to the FCC and say, what must we do? And for sDoC testing, you don't need an accredited lab and you don't need a listed lab, but you need a lab that's got a test facility that meets the standard. For certification testing, the lab must be accredited and it must be listed on the FCC's website for that type of testing. So, will I need a TCB? Yes, you absolutely will if it's a transmitter. It's not an optional thing. You'll need to label it with the FCC identification number. That's your own number that you devise up that will go on it. A bit like the number plate of a car, really. The CE mark says I passed some tests. The FCC ID means if you go into my file on the FCC's website, you will find all of the information of my product. So it's like a traceable reference number of your product. It doesn't just mean it passed or failed. And you always need to keep a sample back in case market surveillance says, send us a sample, we want to test one. You can't say, well, we made 1,000 of them and brilliant news, we sold them all. They'll go, well, you should have made 1,001. Send us one now, we need it. If you want to rebrand somebody else's product, you are able to transfer their certification into your name through a process known as a change in ID. And for Canada, it's called a multiple listing, meaning multiple companies listing the same product. And if you want to change a product that is certified, for sDoC products, you just have to retest them. For certified products, you need to go through a process known as a permissive change. That means a change which is permitted within the certification. And it's if you make any changes to the transmitter hardware, it must have a new certification and a new certification number. But you can make changes to other stuff like antennas, softwares, the enclosure, the shape, any non-transmitter stuff. You can do that within your certification, but you would need to work with the TCB and the test lab about that. Quick comment about modular approvals then, very different to Europe. So let's start off by saying, in general, the USA is the same as Europe. If you certify a radio product for the FCC and then you install it inside something else, you've lost the certification because you've changed the product. However, in the USA, they do have a type of thing called modular approvals. And if you get a specific type of certification on this transmitter, known as modular approvals, it gives it superpowers. And its superpower is that it can keep hold of its certification even when it's inside something else. So if you install a certified module into your product and the module had a modular approval, then it means you don't need to certify the end product because the module manufacturer has already certified it. So the certification number or the FCC ID of the module will be the applicable one. And this is a perfect example of my testing and approvals being separate, because the whole point of it is to reduce the fact that you would end up certifying a transmitter section of a product when the module manufacturer has already certified it. But that doesn't mean you don't test it. You've still got to test the end thing because you've created a whole new product. So you're responsible for testing something that is already authorized. Okay, I'm going to whiz through these slides. I added these, I almost deleted these, but then I thought, you might want to keep hold of them. Just a few slides for your information on the differences between the USA and Canada. They are very separate countries. If you start telling Canadians that they're the same as the FCC, it's a bit like telling a Scottish person that they're English, so be very careful with that. So for the USA, you have this FCC ID and a huge big book of rules. For Canada, you have a Canadian certification number and you have standards that look similar to the EU, but they're a certification route. My top tip is the Canadian standards are much easier to read than the FCC rules. So reading the Canadian standards and going back that way is actually an easier thing. You need a Canadian certification body for Canada certifications and a TCB for the USA. Most companies like Element are both, but not all of them. Again, certification for transmitters, sDoC for the electronics. The FCC will allow certification of electronics. certification or DOC. So for example, you say, well, why would I, if I've got something like a projector here, it's just electronics, I can do DOC on that. Why would I elect to do certification, which kind of is a harsher route because somebody's going to check my homework? Well, the answer is, if you do DOC, you've got to give the name and address of your American company or your American responsible party in the user manual, but for certification you don't. So a lot of non-American companies might go, I'm going to choose to do certification so I don't have to form an agreement with an American company. And a lot of American companies that offer this DOC American rep sort of process or service charge more than a electronic certification. So it's kind of a dodgy economy, I guess. The model number is irrelevant for FCC certification, but it's very, very important for Canada. All your text needs to be in English and French for Canada. Now, for Canada, there is a change that it's not complete grandfathering. When you get a Canadian certification, your product is certified, but you are then expected to keep up with the changing standards. So if somebody comes to you, you don't have to keep changing your certification, but if somebody comes up to you a year later and says, I need to see that you've been keeping up and you meet the latest standards, then you need to do that. Some common mistakes then: keeping all your information consistent in all your technical documentation, not understanding these basic concepts, not testing products, thinking I've got 5 models, I'll test one, and they're all so similar, I'll assume the other 4, I assume that one was the worst case, but those other 4 are just not authorized in many cases, or guessing a worst case mode. Asking a test lab to decide which mode they think you should test,